May I ask everyone to start taking their seats, please? Will you please take your seats? We're about to start the afternoon session. Could you please take your seats? Have fun. If everyone could please take their seats, we'd like to begin. Okay. Welcome to this afternoon session, which will deal with the interface of Europe with the world. This session has 3 components, each of which will last about 35 minutes. In the first segment, will be an interview between Nobel laureate Dr. Mohammed Al-Baradei, Director General Emeritus of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and EUI professors Jennifer Welsh and Olivia Raw on the topic of Europe, the Arab Spring, and its aftermath. In the second period, Professor Bridget Lafan, Director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, will interview Singapore's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kavithnathan Shanmugam, on the relationship between Europe and Asia. Finally, the third dialogue will be an interview by Klaus-Dieter Frankenberger, foreign editor of the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, with Anthony Gardner, the US ambassador to the European Union. The session will end at 4:15.
Thank you. So it's my great pleasure to be able to initiate this interview with Mohammed Al-Baradei, a very prominent figure in international affairs who touches on issues of interest to so many of us who study Europe and who are interested in Europe and the wider world, including, of course, his time as Director General of the International Atomic Energy Association, but also his fascinating period in Egyptian politics. And so Olivier and I will try to share in this discussion, to draw out of some of the immense experience and wisdom that he has to bring to bear. And I guess I want to begin very generally by talking about the so-called Arab Spring. A certain amount of time has passed since the start of the events that we called the Arab Spring, that had so many reverberations well beyond the Middle East. And I want to begin with a general question about your current assessment about the impact that it had, particularly for the region, but also for the wider world.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for your kind words. And my assessment, I think, is a state of aporia, puzzlement, frankly. Puzzlement as how the future will unfold, but not puzzlement as to why the Arab Spring took place. This was not a question of whether, it was a question of when. When you have a part of the world in the 21st century subject to oppression, inequality, poverty, combine that with social network informed young people, combine that with people who are looking for future, who are ready, in fact, to sacrifice their life, as we have seen every week, ready even to die, trying to cross the Mediterranean. It's a work in progress. I mean, it is not an event. It's a process. Mm-hmm. You've gone through that in Europe, except you have done that in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. We're probably a bit late But if you look at some of the experience, it's exactly the repetition of the same experience. An old entrenched regimes, oppressive regimes, who are trying to hold on to power against the people. It was Europe maybe in different way. You had the Pope, you had the monarch. At the end of the day, people said, we don't need either of you. We need to govern ourselves. And that, in a way, the sort of elephants in the room, if you like, who you see right now in the Arab world. Whether it have taken long time, I don't think so. Olivier would remember the French Revolution. I mean, we had a beautiful revolution, and then we had Robespierre, Reign of Terror, the king is back, 2 emperors, wars. So hopefully it would not take us 90 years, but it raises a particular question, how we manage the Arab Spring, how we understand the drivers behind the Arab Spring, and how we manage it, A, to make it go in a peaceful, evolutionary way, and B, to shorten the period. Because there's no question in my mind that people at the end will prevail. It's just a question how to make it less violent and shorter in time. It reverberated in the rest of the world, sure, and it will continue to reverberate. I mean, we like all the time to talk about, a global village, but global village has the positive and the negative. You cannot say global village positively, I'll export my technology, my trade, but you don't want to see the other part of it, which is the immigration, which is the extremism. You cannot quarantine any part of the world as we have seen right now. So we need to understand that if we talk about Europe today, Europe has to be involved, has to understand that they have a major role in managing the Arab Spring or any spring anywhere in the world. And Prime Minister Renzi today talked about Europe exporting healthy dose of oxygen in terms of values. And I think I would argue that's exactly what you can do, and you haven't been doing in the Arab Spring. Soft power, values, freedom, social justice, inequity. The model you have here in Europe, you can have it as a model for how people can live together, irrespective of all what we talk about, race, religion, ethnicity, whatever, which, again, in my view, is not really the real reason. It's an expression of anger. But Europe has a lot more to do than either exporting arms or coming to take pictures in Tahrir Square.
You talk about the role of outsiders in this particular revolution, and you're right that even if we think historically about the French Revolution or others, outsiders played a big role, sometimes in terms of military force. And so I wanted to ask you specifically about the Libya intervention of 2011. And looking back at it now, there's a common criticism that while it might have been motivated by a desire to prevent instability, that in the end what it caused was instability. So I wonder what your assessment is of someone close to the region looking at that particular episode as an episode of how outside actors did try to get involved, maybe not with the strategic wisdom that you would have liked to have seen. But I would love to hear your reactions to the narrative that has built up around the intervention in Libya.
Well, now we move from Europe to the global management, which, again, I would argue that we have a crisis of governance right now. We still work with a system that has been developed in 1945. The world has changed. The institution has not changed. The way government operate has not changed at all. It's still the myopic, short-term policies, while all the problem we are facing today, climate change, extremism, trade, what have you, are threats without border, and yet we continue the way we have used to operate and expect different results. It's not going to happen. And Libya is again one of the issues which raises the whole issue. Do we have really a functioning Security Council? My answer is not. And as a result, we sometimes intervene outside legality where we shouldn't have intervened, like in Iraq. And when we intervene, like in Libya, we intervene in the wrong way. I mean, the idea was to protect civilians. It ended up being really trying to get rid of Gaddafi, and bombing the pro-Gaddafi forces to get rid of Gaddafi. Gaddafi was a horrible dictator. There's no question about it. But you ended up, not completely pulverizing the society, again, coming out from 50 years of total repression, without any thinking of the day after. And that's the problem you have seen in Egypt, you have seen in Libya, you have seen in Syria. You have to manage transition. You manage transition from authoritarianism to democracy. Democracy, as I keep always saying, is not instant coffee. Democracy is a culture. Democracy in institutions. Democracy is to learn how to work together. And you do not expect the countries to get rid of a dictator without having a plan B. And in all these situations, people will already easily agree on what they do not want. It was much more difficult, of course, to agree on what the future would look like. And that's the story, the sad story right now, I think, of the Arab Spring countries, and will continue to be. How we can learn from these sad experiences, how we can learn how to manage transition, how we can, of course, transition has to happen within the country, but whether the international community, whether Europe in particular, supposedly the region where has the most trust in the Middle East, in comparison with the US, for example, the most knowledge of the region, and nobody is asking you to manage the process, but you are needed to manage, as I said, to lead the way, show how your experience came about. For example, that the bloodbath you have gone through, religious wars and all sorts of wars, you learn through it one thing, that you have to live together irrespective of your differences, that you have gone through religious reformation, that you have gone through the Renaissance, which we're sitting here to see. You have gone through the age of reason. These are important experiences which I'm afraid that the Arab world, maybe the Muslim world pretty much in general, has to go through. And you can advise, you can export this healthy oxygen of experience and of values, which you haven't been doing to the way I see it.
Can I just ask one more follow-up before I let Olivier join in? Because what you seem to be describing to us is a model of interaction between Europe and the Arab world, which is much more peer-to-peer, with a historical sensibility. Share experiences, but not the recent past, also the not-so-recent past, as opposed to a relationship where Europe is superior, Europe is providing the answer. But I want to ask just a very specific follow-up about Libya, because it raises a dilemma that I would like to get your view on, and that is, if you talk to those who were engaged in the Libya intervention and its immediate aftermath, some of them will say, actually, there was planning for the aftermath, and there was discussion about some kind of an international footprint afterwards to help manage the aftermath. But Libyans themselves were very reluctant to have it. And there was a deference to that desire to do it on their own. And so how do we manage this desire to respect and not impose versus what you seem to be describing, a need occasionally for some strategic interventions, maybe not of a military kind? I just wondered what your view might be.
Yeah. The strategic intervention will be accepted when people feel that you really care about them, that it's based on human solidarity, Jennifer, and not based on geopolitical interest. I always give the example of Charles Hebdo, when the whole world, rightly so, stood on, up in arms when that happened. The same week, Boko Haram killed 200 people. It was not even reported in the newspaper, or probably in page 13 in one paragraph. So you need to send the message to the recipients that you really care about them as human beings. You know, look at the 900 people who died last week here on the shores of Libya. I mean, only then you started to have meetings and emergency meetings. It is not money. It's a question of, yes, I feel that the rest of the world, Europe, the US, wherever, cares about me. You know, and that feeling is lost in the Middle East. I can tell you that. It's pretty much lost. The people feel that it's all driven by geopolitical interests. Libya, you mentioned, again, I come to Libya. Well, Libya is the field of a proxy wars. I mean, this is, again, there is the so-called political Islam, the so-called seculars, I don't know how you describe them, they're all Libyans, but each one of them is supported by a different faction. For what end, we do not know, but everybody is trying to build power in a region when you have zero system of regional security. It's an open field, you know, and everybody is trying, short-sighted, long-sighted, trying to build or hedge their bets without trying to understand that unless you have a regional security like you have here in Europe, unless you have some semblance of a regime, a structure, you will continue to get this chaos, this mess, particularly in an area when people do not yet understand how to do not have the institutions to work together, and do not understand that there is no other way but to live together. And they are angry. Of course, the inequality, the poverty. So it's very easy then to say, you know, I go back to a different identity because I lost identity with the state. Then my identity is my color, my religion, my ethnicity. And that's what we see, exactly what we have seen before, you know, in Europe. You know, the Protestant, the 30 Years' War. I mean, I can give you lots of examples that it's almost a repetition of what happened, except we're in the 21st century, except some of us, like in Europe, like in the US, have managed to overcome that and understand that war is not the solution, violence is not the solution, tolerance is the way, you know, a democracy is a structure that we need to follow. And these are the kind of things that the earlier you infuse into the veins of the political system of the Middle East, the easier we will go through or bridge this very difficult, violent, terrible transition, which reverberates, as you said, everywhere in the world.
Thank you very much. Back to Egypt. You have been a strong supporter of the Arab Spring. You supported the people in Tahrir Square. Then you became a critic of President Morsi, and you did support the military takeover of General Sisi. You became vice president. Then you resigned in protest against the repression. And you are advocating, you know, comeback of the Muslim Brothers into the political scene in Egypt. And obviously, your voice seems to be a bit lost, you know, in the present, I would say, situation of repression. So how do you assess the political situation in Egypt now under the leadership of General Sisi?
Olivier, I of course supported and continue to support the Arab Spring because it's not just an ethical issue. It's just a question of survival, you know, that if you want to have a future for the Middle East, you have to have a system based on freedom, based on dignity, human dignity, which has been lost in translation for many decades. You know, unfortunately, you know, we put ourselves on the right track, not 100%, because we rushed into election where the young revolutionaries did not have time to organize, have their political parties. We have basically two elephants at that time. It's the army and the Brotherhood, who were organized. The Brotherhood won fair and square, you know. But unfortunately, again, we ended up into a situation that is a very exclusionary regime, which completely is the opposite of what you need in that kind of situation, a national unity, an inclusive approach. In July 2013, I had to be part of an opposition, but basically to say we need an inclusive approach. We need to get a situation when both the so-called Islamists and the non-Islamists, I don't really have a description because I can't describe exactly what Islamists are. I mean, there are so many shades and hues, but what happened afterward was completely not what I signed on. I signed on an early presidential election. I signed on a dignified exit for Mr. Morsi. I signed in for a situation, an inclusive approach where the Brotherhood and the Islamists will be part of it. I signed on a plan which actually has been worked out by my friend Bernardino Leon, who is now trying to do the same in Libya. But then all this was thrown out of the window. Violence started to take hold. And once violence started to take hold, there's no place for somebody like me. I mean, there is not the political space, there is not the... In a society when you don't have a clear concept of justice and of inclusiveness and the political space, then you cannot be effective and you cannot be part of that.
So if you consider that the present situation is not sustainable, do you envisage to play a political role in the future?
Well, I think even since 2011, I believe that the time has come, not only in Egypt, everywhere in the Arab world, for the younger generation to take over. And it's a generation, as I said, the social network generation, the generation that we see in Europe, all the politicians in Europe are between 30 and 50. I mean, in the Arab world, it's mostly octogenarians, and we need to open the way for the younger generation. And I strongly believe since 2011, and I would like, if I have a chance again, to advise, I will continue to advise the young people. They have to organize, they have to have their own political parties, they have to own their leadership. The future is theirs. Our future is behind us.
Thank you very much. And in totally different issue, you have been chief negotiator, with Iran on the nuclear issues. And at that time, you have often been described as a softliner towards Iran, especially from the American hardliners. So now there has been an agreement signed in Lausanne. Do you feel vindicated by this agreement?
Well, Olivier, if being softy means that you believe in negotiation, that you believe that war is not the way, that you believe that you have to negotiate on the basis of respect, that the only solution is a political solution, then I'm glad to be softy and I continue to be softy. But the funny thing, after I left and they became hawkish, they ended up with an agreement which I've been asking for the last 10 years. So I'm absolutely happy to see that agreement. In fact, I talked to many of the European interlocutors who have been working in that for the last 10 years, and they all agree that we could have gotten that agreement 10 years ago on a much better terms, of course, from the Western perspective. But anyway, Iran, to my mind, is one of the issues which royally mismanaged for the last 10 years. I hope we have learned our lessons. I hope we'll get into an agreement. Having Iran on board, in a region, as I said, which is imploding, is absolutely key, because we're not just talking about the nuclear issue. We're talking about, again, the beginning of a rational regional security system, and Iran clearly has to be very much part of that.
But the situation in Iran seems a bit complicated. The guide recently hinted, Khamenei hinted that he might consider that he is not bound by the agreement. So are you optimistic about the future of the relations with Iran on the nuclear issue?
I am optimistic as long as rational people from both sides make the decision. I'm not optimistic when I see 47 senators writing a letter, saying whatever our, commander-in-chief will do, we can undermine. And my reading of it, that Khamenei, of course, seeing that, he's not going to dance all the way to the church. I mean, he has also to say that unless the agreement is balanced, unless the agreement provides that necessary respect to Iran, we are not going to go through it. And from both sides, I've seen in 2 times before in the last 10 years, Olivier, the clear possibility of an agreement with Iran undermined on the altar of domestic politics, and sometime in Iran, sometime in the US. And I hope that will not be repeated right now, because think of not having an agreement with Iran right now, and the implications of, insofar as the region is concerned, security of the region is concerned. So the question basically is, are we going to have people who would like to see a solution to the problem, or are we going to see people who are going to say, there is a problem in the solution and let us bomb our way through? If we are going to bomb our way through, under whatever phase, I can remember the Franz Ferdinand in 1914. I can remember the Peloponnesian War. I can remember the 30 Years' War. You can put any name, but the environment right now, I see it in the Middle East, is an environment of a very belligerent environment, and you just need a match, and I would not think that if a war, God forbid, to start there, is going to be a regional war, is going exactly like the First World War, could explode into a global war.
Just on that note, and I know we have to pass the baton, but can I ask one last question that jumps onto what you were just discussing around looking at this region for a moment through a very pessimistic lens, and what that would mean for Europe and European foreign policy? We could say today that we have Saudi Arabia and Iran waging a war of proxies, but we've seen, particularly with recent events in Yemen, that it's more and more coming towards direct confrontation. Do you think we will see an actual Gulf War between them? And if so, what would that mean for Europe or individual European powers who have taken historically a particular position with respect to states in the region?
Well, I think, Jennifer, there's 2 things which worries me a lot. One is that we have become sort of freewheeling in using force. If you look in the last couple of months, there was a bombing of Syria because the argument that the Syrian regime is not able to take care of what's happening, although the Syrian regime has been undermined by the same people who are bombing the regime. And I'm not making a value judgment. Then we had another war, bombing in Libya, because the Libyan, ISIL killed some Egyptians, and again, there was an act of retaliation. Then in Yemen, there was a president in exile who has asked for help, and then we ended up using force. In Ukraine, in Crimea, again, some minorities asked for outside help, and they got that. How do you, my feeling that the concept of self-defense, which is clearly, narrowly defined in Article 51 of the Charter, is being squeezed, is being manipulated. And that is a very dangerous, way to go through it. Rather than going through sitting around the table, it becomes much easier for us. And I haven't seen, frankly, a Security Council, even in many of these situations, raising a finger, saying, these are not armed attacks. These are not situations that has been authorized by the Security Council, collective security. So this is one worry. The other worry, which is probably not a worry, my feeling right now that in the Middle East, what you really need is, again, I come back to the First World War, is something similar to the Paris Peace Conference. I cannot see how you de-link the Iranian issue, the Libyan issue, the development issue, the Iraq issue, you need to, the Israeli issue, the Palestinian issue, which I should mention, which created huge sense of humiliation in the Arab world, huge sense of anger. You know, you need to put, these are issues are all connected to each other. And my view, you know, is that you need to say, this region need a big picture approach. We need a Middle East, whatever you call it, peace conference. We put all these issues in the pot and try to come out with some sane, rational system by which, at the end, people achieve what the only thing they care about, which is human dignity.
Thank you. Well, now we understand why you were a Nobel laureate on that very humane note about a Middle East peace process. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Bridget Laffin for the next interview.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome Minister Shanmugam, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore, to Florence, which was once a great city-state. And you come from what is now a great city-state. Our conversation will be about European-Asian relations. And both Europe and Asia, Asia-Pacific, have undergone extraordinary change over the last 20, 30 years. Europe has dealt with the collapse of communism, has enlarged to become continental in scale, but then from 2009 onwards, struggled to deal with the financial crisis, and particularly the crisis in the euro area, and in that period became very inward-looking as it tried to save the currency. On the other hand, Asia-Pacific is characterized by extraordinary economic dynamism and, of course, the rise of China. So perhaps before we begin talking, Minister, about Europe-Asian relations, it would be good to hear your perspective on regional dynamics within Asia.
Thank you. If you talk about regional dynamics within Asia, I mean, the starting point, the elephant in the room, as it were, is obviously China. An economy that's $8 trillion on PPP terms, some say it's reached American levels. A rising China that first wants to draw a line below what it sees as a century and a half of humiliation. They never want to be in that position again. A rising China that is confident in its own skin. I mean, the difference between the Chinese and, say, the Japanese or the Indians or others is that the Chinese are, you know, 4,000 years of their own civilization, are not seeking to become like the Americans, are not seeking to become like the Europeans. They want to develop their own institutions and their own system, which they think will be suitable for themselves. And a rising China that wants to have a say in the global order and the global institutions that were formed, and the rules were formed at a time when China was not strong, post-Second World War, the Bretton Woods arrangements. So if their legitimate request for appropriate presence in IMF or World Bank is thwarted, they will set up their own bank. They have the capital for that. So that's one big issue. A rising China, how it is going to be accommodated, what does it mean for stability in Asia and in many other parts of the world? What does it mean for the economy of the world? The most important relationship in the foreseeable future is going to be between Washington and Beijing. How is that relationship going to be structured? How are they going to accommodate each other? I mean, you don't want to put it in very simplistic terms of a rising power versus resident power, but how, and they are so interconnected, but there is also a deep mutual distrust between the two. How are they going to work that out? The US is very much present in Asia in economic terms and military terms as well. Then how is the Beijing-Tokyo relationship going to work out? Because you're talking about the second and third largest economies in the world. That's going to be vital, both in economic terms and in strategic terms, because a Japan that is nervous and a Japan which, if it becomes unsure of the US presence, will start thinking what it will do to defend itself. For the rest of us, if you assess how long does it take for Japan to acquire strategic weapon systems, I mean, this is a country that's technologically very advanced. It has got rocket technology, it's got nuclear power, it's got the ability to miniaturize. How long does it take for Japan to acquire whatever weapon systems it wants? And so that relationship, in the framework of a rising India, which will take a little bit longer, but rising India. And then if you look at Asia, you really have America present, but China, an $8 trillion economy, growing strongly still. Japan, a $4 trillion economy. India at above $2 trillion. And then don't forget ASEAN, the 10 countries of ASEAN together are at about $2.3 trillion, the seventh largest economy. And in Australia, that is increasingly linked up with ASEAN and the rest of Asia at about $2 trillion themselves. So these would create for very interesting strategic economic implications.
And if the 20th century was the century of the Atlantic, the 21st century will clearly be the century of the Pacific. So for Europe, Europe does not border the Pacific. The United States does. So how has Europe and the EU positioned itself vis-a-vis Asia up to now? Is it present? It's clearly present economically, but not so much strategically. So how do you view Europe-Asian relations?
Okay. Let me start by saying, I said this in Strasbourg to the European Parliament 2 years ago. We in Singapore are not among those who write off Europe. I think the reservoir of technology, intellectual capital, excellence, quality, the strengths in culture are such that I think Europe on its own, it really would be wrong to write off Europe. Europe has tremendous strengths. But your question is Europe and Asia. If you look at Asia Pacific, 55% of the world's GDP is controlled by the APEC countries of the Asia Pacific. Includes, of course, the US, the Atlantic countries from Latin America, and on the other side of the Pacific in Asia. I don't like using phrases like the Atlantic century or the Pacific century, but the facts are that the growth and the dynamism in the Pacific region are going to, I think, be continuing for some time to come.
Yes.
And a lot of trade agreements are being structured. I would look at Europe's role at 3 levels. First, and without being prescriptive, what is Europe's role in the kind of issues I spoke about just now, between the relationship between Washington and Beijing, the issues between Tokyo and Beijing, China's role in Asia, ASEAN's role, the other Asian countries. What role does Europe play? I think it's fair to say Europe does not really play a very active role in shaping those issues. Whether it should invest the resources to do so is not a question for me. But I think realistically, if one is frank, Europe is not really the driver or is in the driving seat on any of these issues. And these are the issues that are going to define, I think, the major geopolitical trends in the foreseeable future. That's at one level. At the second level, you look at the actual engagement of Europe in Asia. It tends to be focused on economics, which is fine. It is also tends to be focused on trying to set across some norms, which is fine as long as there is no disconnect between the person who is putting forward those views and the person who is receiving those views. But often there is a disconnect because the views that Europeans put across, are seen to be elegantly contoured to a sort of economic interests. For example, if you talk about values, Europe speaks a little bit softly to countries which are more important economically, and a little bit more stridently to smaller countries that are not as important economically. So one doesn't then see a consistency in the principles. And the principles are often malleable to specific interests. Now that doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that you go out there and beat everyone around the head. Actually, to the contrary, the suggestion is seek a better understanding of the countries that you're dealing with. Let's take China, for example. Europe now speaks quite softly to China. It's important to understand that and acknowledge that if you look at 1980 to 2015, the 35 years, what has happened in China has actually been tremendously good governance, in that 500 million people have been lifted out of poverty with very, very good governance. There is a process and there is a result. If you focus on the result, then what the leadership of China has done in over 35 years has not been done anywhere in the history of human existence. As long as you don't acknowledge that, then there is no basis for a proper conversation. And the Chinese have said to themselves, they are not going to make the mistake of the Russians. They are not going to do glasnost before perestroika. They're going to lift their populations. They're going to bring education. They're going to give primary health care. They're going to put through a whole series of economic reforms before they go into political reform. And anytime you seek to think in terms of reading the tea leaves, and is this leader going to give political reforms? Is that leader going to give political reforms? And that turns up on the first page of your newspapers. And if your foreign policy is driven by what is immediate and present and appeals to sound bites, you're not going to understand Asia. You're not going to deal effectively with politics. And when if you look at sanctions, you look at the nature of the sanctions, and you look at the exceptions that are made, people draw their conclusions. So my point would be, to the extent that it's important to engage, and I think it's important to engage, for Europe to engage Asia, it should be done in a professional way, in a way that is calculated to benefit Europe and benefit Asia.
The EU seeks to speak with one voice, but struggles to speak with one voice. Can I ask you, as a foreign minister who deals with Europe, how complicated is it to deal with the various levels, institutional roles, and then the resilience of domestic foreign policies, of the foreign policies of the United Kingdom, of Germany, of France? The perennial question of who to call in Europe. How problematic is that, or is it something that is just part of the way we do business?
The advantage of being from a very small country, which has got one of the most open trading regimes in the world, is that for us, the Europeans understand us, we understand them, If you look at Singapore, we have more than 9,000 companies from the EU in Singapore, from Europe. In fact, our investments from Europe into Singapore are larger than the investments by the Americans or the Chinese. Not a lot of people realize it. Europe finds it easy to do business with Singapore because, language and the rule of law and the structure and the systems. So we don't face that particular problem because we also don't engage in large strategic issues with Europe. But that is an issue that other countries have raised. But I'm not sure that I can offer you a solution because that's the structure of Europe. National interests seeking to be subsumed within a supranational entity, which has actually taken the idea of supranational entity further than any other organization of comparable size. I think you would have to accept that there will be imperfections, and I speak as a member of ASEAN, so I know how difficult it is to run or be part of supranational entities. Who wants to give up their sovereignty? And you look at the arguments that took place in the run-up to the UK elections.
This is a good time to talk about ASEAN, and ASEAN is perhaps the most mature form of cooperation, interstate cooperation, integration, other than the EU in the world. It started in the end of the 1960s and has gradually evolved institutionally, legally, and in terms of the breadth of its cooperation. Has Europe had any role as a model in terms of ASEAN integration?
Even should we look at EU as a model?
No. No, has it had any role?
Right. Now, I think ASEAN started with very modest ambitions, 5 countries, primarily so that we won't use kinetic force versus each other and try and find a platform that just tries to avoid conflict. I say fairly modest ambitions. It has grown into 10 countries, and it's now talking about an ASEAN economic community of 600 million people, a $2.4 trillion economy with lowering of trade barriers, and a freer movement of people, goods, and services, and trying to become a community. But in many ways, we must recognize, for example, the significant differences between the EU and ASEAN. Why? If you look at the EU, it was formed post-Second World War after centuries of exhausting each other with conflicts. And there was a certain commonality. You say broadly, the civilization is the same, the religion is broadly the same, geographically contiguous, and I think the circumstances were right to move towards a process of coming together. If you look at ASEAN, you have Singapore at a GDP of 60,000, 65,000 US per capita. You have Laos at $1,000 GDP per capita. You have Myanmar at about there in a 60 million population. The economies are very different. Some are totally agrarian, some are very modern. You have all the major religions, in fact, the state religions. You have Philippines, which is completely Catholic. You have Malaysia and Indonesia, which Islam is a state religion, and Brunei, which has introduced Sharia law. You have Thailand and Myanmar, which are primarily Buddhist. The ethnicity of the people are very different. So culturally, geographically, developmentally, and economically, the differences are so huge. I think we'll be foolish to try to get onto a path of the kind of integration that you've had. We've got to do what is doable. What is doable is looking at a closer economic cooperation and trying to take a common position on many issues of regional interest and providing a platform for the major countries to come together and try and deal with regional issues.
And can I ask you, in terms of EU-ASEAN relations, they have strengthened, deepened over time. What is the state of play at this stage? Is there a lot more to be done? How would you evaluate EU-ASEAN relations today?
I'll look at it in two parts. One is economic and the other is, as I say, political, strategic. In economic terms, you're looking at a region that is today, I said, $2.4 trillion. Within 5 years, it will be $4 trillion. And that's fairly standard, growing at about 5-6%, which is the kind of growth it has had. 600 million people, but young. The area has got resources. And a huge need for infrastructure. Some estimates, $8 trillion more. And at the same time, you don't want to repeat the mistakes of others. So you want to grow in a way, and you want to build that infrastructure in a way that deals with issues of climate, environment. And on all those kinds of things, there is tremendous scope for cooperation with the EU, Europe. You have the technology, you have the, you need markets, and ASEAN, as it grows to the next level, is going to be also increasing its consumption, including consumption of high-value goods. And Europe has a cachet in many of those areas. So there's tremendous scope for cooperation. I think EU companies see it. There requires willpower on both sides to try and institutionalize it. For example, Singapore has negotiated an FTA with the EU, but there is a delay because that has been sent for issues of competency to the EU court to go and decide. But as I tell my EU colleagues, if you can't do an FTA with Singapore, you can't do an FTA with anyone. Because we are so small, we are not a threat to anyone's jobs. We are one of the most open regimes. And Singapore is really the New York of ASEAN. So in a sense, if you want to do more trading with ASEAN, you probably will look at an FTA with ASEAN, and a model FTA with Singapore is the way to go. But at a time when Europe is, as I said, I started off by saying I'm a believer in Europe, but at the same time one recognizes the current difficulties that Europe has. Free trade is not sometimes the most popular phrase.
At this time of economic challenge. One final question, and that is about Singapore's role within ASEAN and whether or not it can animate the relationship between ASEAN and Europe.
Our role, we see ourselves as a place where people find it easy to do business. They understand the rules, they understand the laws, rule of law, safety, security. It's the financial capital of ASEAN and one of the largest financial centers in the world. Legal, administrative center for the whole of ASEAN in many ways, because companies locate in Singapore. Within 7 hours of Singapore, you reach Mumbai, Delhi, Beijing, Shanghai, Tokyo, and Australia. So a lot of companies see that logic, a sensible tax regime, transparent. People actually are welcomed to make money. And because we thrive on being a center for services and a center of excellence. So we actually have this vision, as I said earlier, as being the New York of ASEAN. And for that, you need to, project yourself and provide that kind of environment. And our dialogues with Europe and trying to get Europe to look at ASEAN and Asia in many ways, we have been doing what we can. And in fact, we were, together with the French, co-sponsors, the originators of this idea of a Asia-Europe platform, which brings together countries from both sides. It was a little bit ahead of its time because it started in the early 1990s, and it hasn't reached the potential that it has. But we have always been strong believers in linking up the two regions.
Thank you, Minister. I now hand over to Klaus-Dieter Franzenberger for the last interview of this session.
Thank you, Bridget. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this last conversation of our mini-series of conversation. I'm delighted to welcome you, Mr. Ambassador, Ambassador to the European Union. It's great to have you here. You mentioned before that you actually started your career as a stagiaire in the Commission so many years ago. So you are an old hand. It has become rather fashionable these days to say the world is in disarray and the international order is unraveling. Or we only have to look at the turmoil in the Middle East and towards Asia, where territorial disputes can easily get out of hand. Compared to that, the state of transatlantic affairs is in calm waters. But then the EU is still struggling to transit from crisis mode to non-crisis mode. The Greek grammar is still with us, and Brexit may loom around the corner. While the United States is in my judgment, a certain transition period as it enters a new election cycle. How strong, Mr. Ambassador, is this relationship as it confronts the challenges of today and tomorrow's world?
Well, thank you very much. I wanted to start off with a few words to my Italian friends. È sempre un piacere tornare qui in Italia, il bel ricchezza culturale.
Italy, the bel paese. It is the cradle of so much culture and genius and inventiveness, and we're surrounded by that here today.
To the extraordinary role that this country is playing, specifically the Italian Navy is playing, in saving thousands and thousands of lives, desperate people who are trying to make that crossing from Libya and elsewhere. And I think that Europe and the world can be inspired by this work. Secondly, I think I wanted to say that Italy can be proud of its High Representative, the new High Representative, Francesca Mogherini, who is almost beating Secretary Kerry's record in terms of his miles that he's clocking up, touring around the world. But it's not just the energy. She is a valued and a trusted partner of the United States. I think we're in a good spot in U.S.-EU relations. You know, today we're commemorating the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. Tomorrow, as you know, it's the 65th anniversary of the Schuman Declaration. And you know, we talk a lot about values, and sometimes we perhaps say that values are soft, they're not important, but I can tell you I live the importance of values every day. Those values are under attack every day, not just on the borders of Europe and Ukraine, but around the world, whether it's in Syria or in Iraq or in Libya. And I remember a few weeks after I arrived, there was a cartoon that was published in The Economist. And as we know, sometimes pictures are more important than 1,000 words. This cartoon in The Economist was of Vladimir Putin dressed as Cupid with wings. He had just shot an arrow at a tree where someone had carved the initials US-EU. And in the distance, there were two figures walking off in the distance, hand in hand. And one of those people was the President Obama, and the other was a woman dressed in the EU flag. It looked a little bit like Angela Merkel, but it was hard to tell. And the point of the accompanying article is that Putin has reminded us of the ties that bind. I have that picture behind my desk. I look at it every day. Putin is reminding us of the ties that bind. We want this commission to succeed. We think it's perhaps the most experienced commission ever. We share its enthusiasm for its new structures of work, breaking down the silos. We heard Vice President Timmermans speak about it very enthusiastically. We share the enthusiasm on the big themes. Europe should be big on the big things and smaller on the smaller issues. And we certainly have excellent results with this new Trade Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström, with whom we are working on this Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement. And we welcome the focus on the key issues such as better regulation that Vice President Timmermans is responsible for, on energy union, on the investment plan to drive jobs and growth, and of course the digital single market. We do think these are the critical themes facing Europe. And I can tell you, responding to your question, when you look at all of the critical global challenges that we face together, that the United States faces, all of the global challenges, the EU is a critical partner and is the first call we make. We can think of sanctions against Russia, and I was involved intimately in those discussions last summer, and they will become more important as we come to the period of the rollover in June. We can think about Daesh, ISIL, or migration, or Syria, or Iran. It was discussed. On all of these issues, the EU has emerged as a critical, valuable partner of the United States. And I can tell you, the sanctions that we put into place against Russia last summer were a real achievement. It was not obvious that we would be able to put into place similar sanctions at the same time with a body of 28 states whose histories, cultures, vulnerabilities to Russia were so different. It was a real achievement, but we still have work to do. So in answer to your question, I would say we're in a good spot. I'm confident that U.S.-EU relations have evolved and are getting stronger.
You mentioned Mr. Putin. The war in the Ukraine has brought geopolitical conflict back to Europe. Has, in a sense, Russia's behavior reinstilled in us a new sense of togetherness, or in other words, is Mr. Putin the glue that unites the United States and Europe?
Well, I was suggesting that. In fact, I was saying it. Yes. And every day I wake up and to some extent I say, thank you, Vladimir Putin, you're making my job easier. But it's true, he's making my job easier because we all know the history of European integration. It's always moved ahead at moments of crisis, and we're facing not only one crisis, we're facing multiple crises. And we know also that the history of transatlantic cooperation has moved ahead at moments of crisis, and we're at a moment of crisis, several at the same time. So yes, Vladimir Putin has supplied some of the glue, not all of it, but he has certainly focused the minds on the importance of staying together, both in terms of concluding this Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement. You heard today Prime Minister Renzi saying if we don't get it done, it would be an autogol. We would be penalizing ourselves tremendously. And it's important because this is not just about trade. Let's be clear. This has enormous geopolitical connotations here. It's about writing the rules of global trade, about two of the world's the largest global trading partners getting together and deciding that they want to shape globalization rather than be shaped by globalization, because globalization will happen whether we like it or not. And if we don't do it, the emerging, or rather the re-emerging markets of the world are going to write the global rules of trade themselves. So that would supply additional glue.
Before we come to TTIP, let's go a little bit back into history, into your personal history. You served in the Clinton White House almost 20 years ago, are ironically dealing with the same issues in different forms and shades that we are confronted with today. What is the difference of the Europe of today and the Europe of the 1990s as you see it?
Well, you're right. I served in the National Security Council as Director for European Affairs under the Clinton first term. And in those days, there was no Director for EU Affairs. Today there is, interestingly. There's a Director for EU Affairs. Back then, Director for European Affairs. And I remember very well when I arrived the first day at the White House and I said, I want to focus on EU issues, because I just spent a number of years in Brussels. I started my career there. And the answer I got was, that's great, because no one else in this building cares about that stuff. And that's true. It was a very small number of people who were really focused on EU institutions and on the EU. That has changed dramatically 20 years later. Today I can tell you there is now a rather significant group of people who understand how the EU works and who appreciate the impact of what the EU is doing on fundamental interests of the United States. Not only trade, not only economic, commercial policy, but also political security and military affairs. So that has changed dramatically. I'll just give you an example of how things have changed. And this gets to my answer about the broadening and deepening of the relationship. You know, we have 180 people at the U.S. mission to the EU. Only half of them are from the State Department. The other half come from the Department of Commerce and Justice and Agriculture and Treasury and so forth. The entire U.S. government is represented there, and that's a reflection of how deep and broad our relationship is. I'll just give you another short anecdote. One of the first calls I made when I arrived at the White House was to the Office of the Secretary of the Treasury, and I asked the Office of the Secretary of the Treasury, what is our policy about the single currency? And the answer I got was, we don't have one, we don't need to have one, because it will never happen. That's 1994, 5 years later. Of course, it happened. And why do I say this? Because it stayed with me. We must never underestimate the political will of the EU at times of crisis. And we've seen it during the financial crisis. We've all been impressed at what has been achieved, particularly the banking union. And we today will not underestimate the political will. And today we see the EU assuming more and more responsibilities as a result of the Lisbon Treaty. We can get into that. We see the creation of the External Action Service, which has had an impact on us. The creation of, the enlargement of the responsibilities of the High Representative. The end, at least in foreign policy, of this rotating presidency, which has been important. And in practically speaking, very important, the emergence of issues where we were really not interacting in a significant, deep way. For example, law enforcement. Now, 20 years ago, that really was not an issue, a major issue in U.S.-EU relations. Today, I just spent a day at Europol, and I got a full briefing of everything we are doing with Europol, an EU institution, together combating against cybercrime, human trafficking, and many other issues. So, it's much broader and deeper, and the U.S.-EU relationship reflects that.
Do you think, as it affects the relationship with the United States, that this whole leadership issue and the famous questions of the telephone number, who to call in the middle of the night, that these questions are answered or more efficiently today than when you were in the NSC?
I've never been a big fan of that idea that one needs to have a single telephone number, because frankly, if I were sitting in Europe, that question often would not be clear. What number do you call in the United States? It really depends on the issue. Of course, you could call the president, but practically speaking, it depends on the issue you're dealing with. It could be the State Department, could be Commerce, could be other areas as well. But I think, as I mentioned before, that the Lisbon Treaty has made the question, I think, now clear, because on most issues, you do have, in the form of now this new High Representative, and on many issues, a telephone number to call. Also, you have the creation of an important post, I didn't mention it before, but the post of the President of the European Council, that plays a key role in driving forward a strategic agenda, and we see it being played very effectively by Donald Tusk. So that is another phone number to call, and on some occasions, it would be the number of the President of the European Commission. So it depends. The short answer is yes, I think it's now much clearer.
Mm-hmm. You already mentioned the fact that today marks the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. Or, as we can see, territorial aggression and war is back in Europe. I don't want to ask you the question what went wrong, but I would like to ask you, or to push you a little bit further, how can we get to a less confrontational and less frustrated relationship with Russia?
Well, we're certainly trying. I mean, look, we've been very clear from the beginning of this crisis. I was on many, many calls this summer and later on. We've been very clear to the Russians that there is another way. There is another way. Their diplomatic track is open. We continue to be committed to the Minsk Protocol. The trouble is that life is not easy when you're faced with a partner who speaks one thing and does another, and violates the substance of the Minsk Protocol even today. We continue to urge the Russians to respect that Minsk Protocol in all of its specifics. And this is important, because in June, the European Council will be meeting to decide the rollover of sanctions. At the March European Council meeting, it made a very clear and important statement, and it said that at the June Council meeting, sanctions will be extended if Russia has not implemented all, not some, all of its commitments under the Minsk Protocol. And by definition, some of the things of the Minsk Protocol cannot be implemented until the end of the year. It would be shocking if that June European Council meeting arrives at any other conclusion except the rollover of sanctions. So that's one thing, and there will be challenges ahead, certainly not only in June but going forward, to maintain the sanctions and, if Russian behavior warrants it, even to scale up sanctions. But to be clear, there are two tracks. One is sanctions, and the other is the diplomatic track that we're pursuing. Now, the problem is, fundamentally, in my view, that the Ukrainian people spoke. They decided to join a free trade area with the EU. It was their sovereign decision to do so. And today you've seen one of the ironic consequences of Putin's actions, that he has solidified the pro-Western orientation of that country. And not only in Ukraine, he has also solidified the pro-Western aspirations of many other countries. Now imagine back in the early 1990s, had we said to the Baltic republics or to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that no, you cannot join the European Union because we may risk alienating Russia, it would have been unthinkable. It would have been immoral. So it was absolutely right that the Ukrainian people had expressed their desire to join, to sign up to a free trade agreement, and should be allowed to do so. It's been postponed, as you know, until the 1st of January 2016, but no further. So I don't think we've made many mistakes, but we certainly hope that the Russians will fulfill their obligations so we can...
The West has responded asymmetrically towards the Russian aggression. But sanctions, then, we have to admit, are not popular. Not in my country, not here in Italy, not in many countries, many European countries. Have you any indication that they had an impact in moderating Russia's behavior so far? And what makes you think that if we imposed even stricter sanctions, that this may be the case?
Well, it's interesting. I often get asked that question. No one knows, but let me just remind everyone that, well, two things. Sanctions are working. We do see the impact on the Russian economy very clearly. It's irrefutable. There's a second question, which is a very different question. Are these sanctions enough to change the calculus of Vladimir Putin? And we don't know, but these are still early days. We see an impact not only on the Russian economy, but even on those who are close to Putin. The second point I want to make as well is this is often the narrative in Europe, is that just European companies are suffering the consequences of sanctions. That just isn't true. American companies are also suffering the consequences of sanctions. Not only just ExxonMobil, $1 billion, not just GM, $600 million, but many other U.S. companies are suffering the impact of sanctions. So it's false to say that all of the burden is falling on Europe and none on the United States. The second point I want to make, people forget. Let's put this into context in terms of the pain. The euro is depreciated significantly. Oil prices have declined significantly. They've bumped up recently, but they're still low. So we do have some good tailwind. It's not all bad news. We need, and this is my final point here, we need to be willing to pay the price over a longer term because fundamental principles are at stake. The principles here is, can a country decide of its own will to redraw the borders of Europe in the 21st century? My final thought on this. The United States does not border Russia, but has fundamental interests at stake in what is going on in the Ukraine. We're still a global power. People are watching us. I would suggest people are watching Europe's reaction. It's not only the Chinese, it's the Iranians and many others. And if we allow one country to redraw the boundaries of Europe and to act in this way, I would suggest the consequences would far outweigh the economic impact.
Now, let's come to the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. TTIP is one of the projects that are meant to bind us together. So the political and commercial advantages are clear, the benefits are clear, it has strategic implications. Prime Minister Renzi urged us a few hours ago to conclude it by the end of this year. Now, it seems that this may be a hope, a pious hope. What are the prospects of it? What do you think?
Look, we are committed to this deal. The narrative in Europe that we're not sufficiently committed to the deal is just not right. We are focused, it is true, on getting the Trans-Pacific deal done, and the reason for that is that it's 97, 98% done. It's natural that our focus is on TPP. We're focused on getting the Trade Promotion Authority done, and we're close. It could be actually imminent. But it doesn't mean we're not committed to a transatlantic agreement, because we do see the trade impact, the positive trade impact, and we see the importance from a geostrategic point of view. So we want to get it done. Now, we are moving in the right direction, right? We see comments of support from the heads of state, from all the heads of state of the 28. We have a commission that is fully committed to getting this deal done. We see, as I mentioned to you, a strong partner in Cecilia Malmström. What we need to see, to be honest with you, is that level expressions of support from heads of state translated back into the member state bureaucracies and then to the Commission in terms of its negotiating flexibility. But we have gotten a lot done. We have 7 consolidated texts out of 22 working groups after 9 rounds. So we've made significant progress. We need to unblock 2 things that are intimately related to one another, and that is our tariff offer and our services offer. And it's been disappointing, but we are confident that we can unblock those, whereby the United States would raise its offer, its first offer, to the Commission's offer of reducing tariff by 96%, in fact go beyond 96%, and at the same time encourage the Commission to do better than its first offer on services, which we consider to be disappointing, but we are optimistic we're going to get there. My main point here, because we don't hear it often in the EU narrative, is that the EU has offensive interests in this deal, not just defensive interests, including in agriculture. Just think of Italy. We're in Italy, so let's talk about Italy. Italy has offensive agricultural interests. There's a 6 billion positive trade balance between the EU and the United States, especially in agriculture. It's grown 36% over the past 10 years. Italy has done tremendously well in selling products that we all can imagine: wine, cheese, pasta, oil, preserved fruits, vegetables. I would just please let my compatriots, Americans, enjoy more pasta, more olive oil, more fruits and vegetables, more Italian goods, please. I would love them to enjoy the fruits of high-quality Italian agricultural products. Italy can win. Europe can win. And I say that because I travel around Europe frequently, and I hear expressions of fear. Fear that Europe can't compete, fear about globalization, fear about big government, and so on. Europe should have a little bit more confidence that actually it can win in this deal. And what's been a real challenge for me is dealing with a social media which has been almost taken over by a rather small minority, if I can say, of individuals who are putting out misinformation, actually I would say disinformation. I know I'm being a little controversial, but disinformation. And we're trying to combat it, and it's hard to do so when you have a respect for facts, and sometimes your opponents don't have respect for facts. Let me just cite you one example, and here let me be really controversial. I recently saw on the website of Stop TTIP Italia a photograph of Martin Schulz and Paolo De Castro, member of the European Parliament, former agriculture minister, holding up signs saying "Stop TTIP." And I thought, well, that's rather curious. Let me look into this. And it turns out that the photos were doctored. The photos were doctored. Now, that is the kind of campaign we are facing. We're also facing NGOs that are very well financed, and it's not clear by whom. And let me be very clear about this.
You allude to Russia?
Well, let me be very clear about this. We're all in favor of transparency. Transparency is good. We favor social media, civil society, full stop. But transparency is a two-way street, not a one-way street. And the NGOs in Europe should make clear for whom they speak and by whom they are financed, and is not the case today. In the United States, most NGOs publish their financial statements, and it is clear for whom they speak and by whom they are financed.
But it is a reality that there's a lot of resentment out there. What explains this resentment? And have governments who are on record of favoring the conclusion of TTIP and the business communities in various countries been sleepwalking into this?
Look, we need to do a better job. I don't want to point fingers. I think governments can do a better job. We haven't been very good about articulating the need, the importance of this deal. We're using too many statistics. We're not using enough stories. We're not making it real for the average person on the street, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. This is not a deal for big multinationals and big businesses who are going to grab most of the profits. We're beginning to do it. We can do more. And I can tell you, of all the arguments I've been road testing around Europe, it is absolutely fascinating to see which work and which don't work. And for me, it was a huge surprise to see that the argument that really, really doesn't work is the argument about jobs and growth in a Europe that is not growing. And the reason for that is people don't believe the statistics and the projections that were put out there by the European Commission and others. People don't believe it. Gets to your question. People are skeptical. I don't think it's anti-Americanism. I think it's skepticism about big governments. It's skepticism about Brussels. It's fear about globalization. And people don't believe these predictions. But I'll tell you the arguments that do seem to get traction. Number one, the argument that this deal has a geostrategic implication. I mentioned it before. Across political spectrum, across countries, people understand that yes, the US and the EU, who share values, should get a free trade deal done for the geostrategic dimension. The second argument that seems to work is energy. Europe is still vulnerable in terms of its energy. Now, we're not going to solve that problem, but I can tell you that this deal, by virtue of the fact the EU would be a free trade partner of the United States, would make the export of liquid natural gas from the United States quasi-automatic. Today, you have to go through a permitting process, and it is a long one. With an FTA, Europe would benefit from higher volumes of gas, and importantly, prices in Asia have come down compared to Europe. It used to be much higher. I think it was double. Now it's much closer. So a lot of that volume, starting at the end of this year into early next year, would come onto the European market and would address Europeans' energy vulnerability. The third argument I use is a bit of an academic argument, but I think it's real. What we're trying to do, to a certain extent, is to take a few pages out of Europe's single market, reduction of tariffs, elimination of obstacles to trade, and everyone in Europe understands that the single market has been an engine of prosperity and growth. And finally, people understand, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, that Europe is a high-cost place to do business. Labor and energy are two reasons. And if we can succeed in addressing that issue, then we will all benefit.
Bridget, with your permission, one issue has to be included in this conversation about the transatlantic relationship, and this is the NSA spy scandal. So, it is particularly strong, it has particular ramifications in my country because it limits the room for maneuver of the government, and it has made difficult for the government to defend intelligence cooperation. Trust has been lost, trust has been eroding. Has your government done enough to address the questions, answer legitimate criticism? What would you say? Has trust been restored?
Well, let me just start with an anecdote, because I am a big believer in traditional ways of gathering information. I believe in diplomacy and relationship building. My father was lucky enough to be ambassador to Italy between 1977 and 1981. And I remember a story because it stays with me today. One day my mother went to my father and said, the Italian government will fall tomorrow. And my father says, well, that's very strange. I haven't heard that. Let me check with my senior staff. He calls the senior staff, and they all say, nonsense. The Italian government is safe and secure. The next day, the Italian government falls. So my father goes to my mother and says, how on earth did you get that information? My mother says, well, my dear, I was at the hairdresser's yesterday, And next to me was the wife of a minister of the Italian government who told me everything. You know, really, you should spend more time. You should spend more time with the hairdressers and less time talking to your senior staff. So I remember that today. I believe in traditional diplomacy, but to be serious, there is a perception of a loss of trust. It's very significant. We do not take it lightly. I do not take it lightly. I can tell you when I arrived to take up my post in March of last year, it was issue number 1. And to be brief, but try to be succinct here, we are certainly trying to address that issue in several concrete ways. We are negotiating an agreement that tries to modernize and upgrade the Safe Harbor Agreement, which is a framework that was signed in year 2000 between the Department of Commerce and the European Commission, that allows for collection of consumer information by companies, American and European companies, and allow them to send it back to the United States. And the reason they were able to do that is that the Commission found the U.S. protections for that data to be of adequate level, similar level to the EU. Now, after the Snowden revelations, the European Commission came up with a series of recommendations. We're very close to finalizing all 13 recommendations, hopefully in the next few weeks. So that will hopefully be a step in the right direction. We are also very close to finalizing a data privacy and protection agreement for the exchange of information between law enforcement authorities. Very important. And why do I mention this? Part of it, and this is, I feel passionately about this because I fought for it personally, and I succeeded in having the White House and the interagency agree to table legislation, this is the judicial redress language, that would extend the rights that U.S. citizens have to sue in U.S. court to non-U.S. citizens, in this case, EU citizens. And it would address the issue of discrimination, which has existed to this day, whereby an American can benefit from the same rights as Europeans in Europe, but a European doesn't benefit from the same rights as an American before U.S. courts. Now, in the context of that exchange of law enforcement data, that would change this de facto discrimination, and it's very important substantively and also symbolically. Also was mentioned, I won't repeat all of it, but Gilles de Kerkhove mentioned a few important things. I would just ask those in the audience who are skeptical, please, a lot of this is public information. The President made an important speech, Policy Directive PPD 28 in January of last year, articulating very clear limitations on how we collect, keep, and disseminate, use information. It's been translated into implementing regulations by the intelligence community, and it's been mentioned also we have reintroduced before Congress the so-called Freedom Act, which was scaled back in important ways, the Patriot Act, which was passed 9/11, and the Freedom Act would prohibit bulk collection and would require phone records to be stored by the phone companies themselves. And other things have been happening as well. The appeals court of the Second Circuit yesterday found that the Patriot Act can't be interpreted as allowing systematic bulk collection of domestic phone records. My important point, I'll end with this. This is not a you versus us issue. This is not a Europe versus the United States issue. Citizens on both sides of the Atlantic care deeply about their data privacy and are both struggling on both sides of the Atlantic to find the right equilibrium between data privacy and how to protect our societies when we are under attack. A lot has happened.
Thank you. Bridget, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for the richness of the conversations. And after coffee, we will hear from Federica Mogherini, High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and for Security Policy. And she's been given responsibility to develop a strategic document for Europe and the world. And that is the next, in a sense, chance that Europe has to set itself an agenda for its aims and objectives in the world out there. And so I want to take advantage of our three speakers to ask them, what would they like, because we want to set an agenda here, what would they like Federica Mogherini to put in that document? What are the things that they would like to see there before it goes to the European Council to be discussed? So let me begin by Mohammed El Baradi.
Well, I'd like to see more on, again, exporting what is missing in the Middle East, education, institution building, supporting civil societies, trying to be a real partner in the sense of somehow sending the message that you do care about these people, that it is not a question of just neighbors or non-neighbors, it's a question of people in need, and you have experience, you have knowledge, you have technology, and you would like to stretch your hand. I think that would be, and of course, trying to find a way to resolve the issues that are preventing people to live together, and make them understand that we're all, at the end of the day, same human beings, and we should find a way to live together.
So an emphasis on Europe as a civilian power, institution building, education, technical assistance.
That's exactly it. That's what we needed. And stop exporting arms. That's the last thing we need in the Middle East right now.
Bravo. Minister.
Bridget, I would say it will only work if Europe sees itself as benefiting from whatever is being done. I mean, for us to say engage with Asia, what is the raison d'etre? Economics. I think there can be a better plan for EU, Europe to engage with Asia, particularly us. I mean, China is a known story, but the other countries in a more systematic, substantive way. There are other things which can be on the wish list, but I think one would start with this.
So systematic, more strategic as opposed to process and...
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador.
Well, I'll be brief. The thing I would like to see more is the EU over time, I'm not unrealistic, the EU over time adopt more competence over law enforcement and even counterterrorism. And I think it's just a reflection of the world we live in, that it's one thing to engage bilaterally with member states, but I think the EU will or should seriously consider moving some of the competences to a centralized level at Europol and other institutions.
Thank you. That would certainly be an interesting treaty negotiation on the strengthening of EU-level internal security cooperation. We now have some time to take some questions from the audience. Can I ask you, as a courtesy to our speakers, if you would identify yourselves? So who would like to open the discussion? Okay, so one here. Okay, please, and then, okay, thank you.
My name is Stefan Aura. I'm Director of European Studies at the University of Hong Kong. I would like to thank you. I would like to thank all panelists. It was a fantastic conversation. But my question is directed towards the American ambassador. Excuse me. I am tremendously grateful that you mentioned the threat of Russia. And I admire your resolution to deal with Russia. I didn't feel from European participants over the 2 days of the conference to speak with the same confidence and with the same commitment to values that the West stands for. But there is one question I have, and that is, would you say that both the United States and the European Union have misjudged Putin in the past? I come from Central Europe, from Czechoslovakia, and the Polish political leaders, intellectuals, were suspicious of Russia 10, 20 years ago. Their concerns were dismissed as paranoia. Would you say that they were vindicated and that the leaders in the West were proven wrong in treating Russia as a partner?
Thank you. There's a question here, just here on my...
Thank you. Roberto Castaldi, I'm professor at eCampus University and director of the International Center for European and Global Governance. I wanted to ask a question to the three of you, in fact. It seems to me that the shift of the American strategic focus to the Pacific has created a power vacuum that is fostering instability all around Europe, in the Middle East and to the east. But notwithstanding these big geopolitical challenges, nobody is discussing about European defense. President Juncker did a few weeks ago, but nobody took it up. Even if in the Lisbon Treaty, one of the novelty of the Lisbon Treaty was precisely permanent structured cooperation on defense. Still, the 28 member states have the second military expenditure in the world with almost no capacity and no capability to try and help stabilize the neighborhood, really. What do you think about this challenge that Europe seems not to be ready to take up? Thanks a lot.
Two very important questions. Is there a third intervention? Yes, right to my left, and then we'll return to the speakers.
Yes, thank you. In a way, I would like to unite the two previous questions, especially because yesterday at the EUI, the session, we spoke also about NATO and the contribution of different member states of the European Union to the budget of NATO. And today we have heard about the big threat of Russia and about European defense community. So my question is to the American ambassador once again. What would be your perspective on the eventuality that the member states of the European Union, as today we know they are not all members of the NATO, what if, considering the big threats facing us today, the European Union would decide, for example, that individual member states should not be members of NATO, but it would be compulsory for all of the European Union as one single body to join the NATO and therefore also contribute to the budget and participate in cooperation?
Thank you. I'll now we'll take the response from our three speakers. Mohammed Al-Baradi.
Well, I think they opened another Pandora's box, which is defense and deterrence and security. Well, there's a lot to be said on that. I mean, my views, and I think at least Barack Obama and many others, that we still live under a security system that's not sustainable because it relies on nuclear weapons, and Europe still mostly sitting under the nuclear umbrella, the US nuclear umbrella. We have like 30 around the world privileged countries that are relying on nuclear deterrence, and we are asking everybody else not to touch a nuclear weapon. Well, that to me is not sustainable. That to me is not a fair system of governance. So instead of talking about European security, we really need to start by talking about global security and what kind of security system we should have. Clearly, to my mind, it should be a security system that does not depend on nuclear weapons, the kind of weapons that could lead us in any of these situations we're talking about into sleepwalking, into self-destruction.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you. I will deal with the second question, which is about, I suppose, to put it in simpler terms, the feeling that every region in the world feels about or worried about being abandoned by the United States. Everyone wants to be left by the US. And people in Asia feel, well, we wish the US would be more focused in Asia Pacific and help maintain the balance, not just in the interests of the Asian countries, but also in the interests of the United States itself. So I can understand the concerns about US role in Middle East, other areas. If I can link it back to something I said earlier, what role does EU see for itself in the world? If you want to shape the big questions that face us outside of Europe, then you need to be able to play that role. That role just doesn't come from being able to trade alone. You need additional strategic ability. And the question is whether you're prepared to pay for it. That is what the US does. When the US does the TPP and engages with Asia and maintains a balance, it does so with the force of the 7th Fleet behind it in the Pacific. And so that is a question only Europeans can answer. But if you answer it in the way that you want to play that role, then there is a certain cost to it. It requires political will. Then you would be able to play that role. US, I think, as with any other country, would be focused in the areas where its interests are most impacted. But which area, which region in the world is not of interest to the US Secretary of State? I think one can draw one's conclusions. But today, a significant part of the economic focus of the US is Europe and I think Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Minister. Ambassador.
So the question about NATO membership, and I have to be careful because I'm not the ambassador to NATO, I'm ambassador to the EU, but it's clear the EU obviously cannot make compulsory NATO membership. That's quite clear. But what we can see from this crisis is that in countries which have been neutral, including Finland and in Sweden, the issue is not off the table. In fact, it is on the table because of the overflights of Russian planes, often without transponders, which makes them very dangerous, because of the submarines that are patrolling close to those countries. It's another example of how Russia's actions right now are undermining their own long-term strategic goals. The issue of NATO membership is on the table. And who would have thought that there would be pre-positioning of NATO materiel forward in Central and East European countries? Who would have thought that we would have as many drills, exercises in the countries that now feel themselves threatened? Mr. Putin has undermined his long-term strategic interests there. Now, we recognize, importantly, the EU's military role. It has military missions in Africa. It has military missions as well in the Balkans. And they play a fundamental role. I spent a day at our AFRICOM, our military headquarters, dealing with all of our African missions. It's in Stuttgart. And I can tell you the head of that Army unit at AFRICOM was full of praise for what the EU is doing. And it's an example of what we're doing and how our relationship has changed so much. We are close, I believe we are close to signing an agreement with the EU that would facilitate the sale of goods and services to EU military missions. Why? Because there are areas where we don't want to be present, we don't have the capacity. The EU is present and does have capacity. Now, in terms of the European Army, well, I heard what President Juncker has said, but I think it's important to put the cart before the horse. There's so much work that needs to be done, frankly, before that vision becomes a reality. It's spending. Spending is still is much lower than where it needs to be. Cooperation, creation of single platforms is where Europe has to go. So this focus on the creation of a European army without having done the hard work of increasing spending, it's happening in a few countries, in Poland as an example, but cooperation, single platforms is absolutely essential. Now, in terms of were we wrong to treat Russia as a partner, well, it's easy to look backwards and say we were wrong, we were misguided, but the fact is we had to try. You know, the reset policy has been criticized, but we had to try. And in fact, there were numerous instances where we did work closely with Russia. In fact, where we still are working closely with Russia. Russia was at the table during the Iranian negotiations. So it's false to say that we have stopped all cooperation with Russia. But it's interesting, when I talk to people who were at the table during those critical years, I'm told repeatedly that at the highest levels, the Russians never really expressed deep concern about NATO expansion. The real issue of concern was EU expansion and the economic impact on the Russian economy, and more significantly, the impact on those around Putin, the oligarchs. And I'm convinced that is at the center of what triggered this crisis. Well, first, the view widely held that the Ukraine is not a sovereign state and doesn't have the right to take sovereign decisions. And number two, that the impact of a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement would impact oligarchs' entrenched monopolies in the Ukraine, and that they could not accept, which is why they are now asking for the to pushing back the implementation of the DCFTA from the 1st of January 2016 to 2017 and beyond. That cannot be tolerated. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you. It's now time to bring this session to an end. May I begin by thanking our three speakers for their time, for their analysis, and for their frankness. And my takeaway is, if Europe can't sign a free trade agreement with Singapore, it can't sign a free trade agreement with anyone. And there's no doubt that for Europe, the kind of Europe we will have in 2050 will be determined largely by how Europe deals with that world out there. So thank you all very much for your time, and my colleagues for engaging in the discussion. Thank you.